You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The region located south of the Ohio River and to the west of the Kanawha River, also known as the Kentucky Country, named after the Kentucky River in today's eastern Kentucky, was historically claimed by the Iroquois Confederacy. This claim came about during their victories in the 17th century Beaver Wars. Though the Iroquois were considered the most dominant Native American nation in the northern colonies, other tribes also staked claims on this area and frequently hunted there. Following the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, the British successfully negotiated with the Iroquois for the lands south of the Ohio River. However, this agreement didn't sit well with many Ohio Indian tribes who had long hunted on these lands, leading them to refuse to recognize the treaty and to stand ready to defend their hunting rights. Leading the charge against this agreement were the Shawnee, who were significant players among the Ohio Valley's allied Algonquin tribes. They quickly formed a large coalition, the Shawnee Ohio Confederated Indians, to oppose both the British and the Iroquois, aiming to protect their territorial claims. British officials attempted to weaken the Shawnees' position by dividing them from other native nations diplomatically. When conflict eventually erupted, the Shawnee, with few allies at their side, found themselves up against the Virginia militia. After the treaty was signed, a wave of colonial explorers, surveyors, and settlers flooded into the area, leading to immediate and direct encounters with the Native Americans of the upper Ohio Valley, particularly along the Allegheny River. George Washington, in his journal entry dated November 17, 1770, noted the Native Americans' skillful canoe handling, including that of the women, and mentioned their hunting camps and cabins along the river used for transporting furs to market. Back in September 1773, the well-known pioneer Daniel Boone was at the forefront, guiding roughly 50 settlers through the Powell River Valley in Tennessee. Their goal was quite ambitious: to establish the very first settlement by white colonists in what is now known as Kentucky. On an unfortunate day, October 9th, just below the Cumberland Gap, disaster struck. Boone's eldest son, James, who was just 16 at the time, along with a few men and boys who had gone back to fetch supplies, found themselves in a deadly confrontation. They were ambushed by a coalition of Delaware, Shawnee, and Cherokee warriors. This attack was a clear, violent statement from these groups expressing their strong opposition to the settlers' incursion. The aftermath was grim. James Boone and Henry Russell, a young teenager whose dad would later become a noted officer in the Revolutionary War, were not just captured, but also subjected to torture until their death. This heinous act sent shockwaves of horror throughout the frontier communities, and ultimately, Boone and his companions felt compelled to call off their pioneering mission. By December, news of this tragic event had spread, making headlines in newspapers in Baltimore and Philadelphia. What happened to Boone's party was pivotal, marking a turning point that led to what history would remember as Lord Dunmore's War. The years that followed saw continuous attacks by various Native American tribes who hadn't agreed to peace treaties. These attacks were marked by the brutal killing and torturing of captured men, and horrifyingly, the taking of women and children into captivity. Boone's attempt was but the first in several efforts, part of a larger plan with Richard Henderson, a land speculator, aiming to establish the Transylvania colony in Kentucky. Back in 1769, a man known for his skills as an Indian fighter and a trailblazer named Ebenezer Zane founded a settlement he called Zanesburg on Wheeling Creek, just past the Pennsylvania boundary on the Allegheny. This place is now known as Wheeling, West Virginia. A key location, Fort Fincastle, was later established there. Moving beyond Pennsylvania into the Allegheny Valley, another early settler was Captain Michael Cresap. Cresap owned a trading post at Redstone Old Fort, which today is Brownsville, Pennsylvania, situated on the Monongahela River. Backed by the colonial government of Virginia, Cresap managed to acquire large areas of land around and below where Middle Island Creek meets the Ohio River, a place we now call St. Mary's, West Virginia. In the early spring of 1774, Cresap brought a group of men with him to start a settlement on these lands. In the spring of 1774, George Rogers Clark, who would later become a well-known general during the Revolutionary War, and his group were camped at the mouth of the Little Kanawha River, now located in Parkersburg, West Virginia. They were waiting for other Virginians to join them on their journey downriver to settle in Kentucky. However, they started hearing unsettling news. Hostile Native Americans were attacking traders, surveyors, and others traveling along the Ohio River. To bolster their defense, they invited Captain Michael Cresap, a settler with military experience who was also heading to Kentucky, to join them. Cresap, aware that any wrong moves could lead to war, suggested they go upstream to a safer location, Zanesburg, later known as Wheeling, to see if the hostilities would decrease. Upon their arrival, they found the community in chaos, frightened by the brutal attacks from Native Americans. Colonists, worried about the safety of their families, gathered in the town seeking protection. A message from John Connolly, who commanded Fort Pitt further upstream, confirmed their fears. Local tribes, like the Shawnee and Delaware, were preparing for war. On April 26th, Cresap convened a meeting where he shared Connolly's message. The gathering decided to declare war against the Native Americans. The very next day, after spotting some Native American canoes on the river, the settlers pursued them for 15 miles to Pipe Creek, where a skirmish ensued, resulting in casualties on both sides. After this encounter, Clark's group abandoned their plans to continue to Kentucky. Expecting further retaliation, they retreated along with Cresap's men to the safety of Cresap's headquarters at Redstone Old Fort. Shortly after the attack at Pipe Creek, settlers took the lives of the family members of the Mingo leader Logan, marking a tragic shift in his previously peaceful stance towards them. Logan, who had been camping with his hunting group on the Ohio River's west bank near today's Steubenville, Ohio, was not involved in the incident that led to this violence. On April 30th, some of his party, including his brother John Petty and 2 women closely related to him, went to visit Joshua Baker, a settler who traded rum at his cabin. Tragically, while they were inside, about 30 settlers led by Daniel Greathouse stormed in and killed the members of Logan's party, sparing only an infant girl. The aftermath saw Logan mistakenly attributing the massacre to Cresap, although others familiar with the event, including Clark, were aware that Greathouse and his men were the actual assailants. This massacre heightened fears among the settlers of retaliation by the remaining Native American communities in the Ohio country. Many settlers sought refuge in blockhouses or fled eastward, with some even returning over the Allegheny Mountains, anticipating reprisal attacks. True to their fears, Logan, alongside small groups of Shawnee and Mingo warriors, launched retaliatory strikes against frontier settlements, avenging the tragic losses suffered at Yellow Creek. In May of 1774, William Preston, a field surveyor, wrote a detailed letter to George Washington, who was overseeing the construction of a frontier fort at the time. In his letter, Preston shared updates and concerns tied to the unfolding events leading up to Dunmore's War. Here's what he shared. On May 27, 1774, from Fincastle, Preston informed Washington that he kept his promise by instructing Mr. Floyd, his assistant, to survey Washington's land along the Coal River en route to the Ohio. Shortly after completing the survey, Mr. Floyd sent the results via Mr. Thomas Hogg. However, Preston relayed troubling news from Mr. Spotswood Dandridge, who reported that after leaving the survey team, Mr. Hogg and 2 companions had vanished without a trace. Preston expressed worry about not having been able to contact Mr. Floyd again, but remained hopeful that the survey courses would be sent to him by the next available person. He had instructed Floyd to do this as a precaution. Preston also shared his concerns about the potential impact of Native American resistance on their work. He mentioned that their team, which had dwindled to 33 people, feared for their safety. This fear, he suspected, could significantly hinder their surveying efforts for the year. The letter touched on a long-standing debate about whether the Louisa or Cumberland rivers defined the boundary with the Cherokee territory. Preston included a report from scouts he had commissioned, which he believed resolved the dispute conclusively. Furthermore, Preston expressed his bewilderment over the Cherokees' new claims to lands west of the Louisa River and between the Cumberland River and the Ohio, which were lands previously sold to the English according to treaties in 1744, 1752, and 1768. He was concerned that if the government conceded to these Cherokee claims, they would lose access to the most valuable parts of that country. Lastly, Preston's correspondence implied that the actions of early explorers and surveyors like themselves, rather than those of settlers, were greatly aggravating to the Shawnee, Cherokee, and other Native American groups, sparking tensions that would eventually lead to conflict. In early May of 1774, Lord Dunmore found out that conflicts had started at Yellow Creek and other areas along the Ohio River. He asked the legislative body to set up a regular army to address the increasing violence. However, the House of Burgesses, the legislative body, preferred to rely on temporary militias instead. While they showed support for Boston and talked about a boundary dispute with Pennsylvania, they didn't manage to extend the law that allowed the militia's existence. Consequently, on May 26, 1774, Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses and, leveraging the powers granted to him by the soon-to-expire Invasions and Insurrections Act, called Virginia's local militias to action. According to the historians Eric Hinderaker and Peter C. Mancall in their 2003 work, At the Edge of Empire, Dunmore then prepared to move towards the Ohio area. He divided his forces. He led 1,700 men from Fort Pitt, what is now known as Pittsburgh, and another group of 800, led by Colonel Andrew Lewis, set out from Camp Union, present-day Lewisburg, West Virginia. The plan was for these two groups to meet at the Great Kanawha River's mouth. Following this strategy, Dunmore made his way to Fort Pitt, and from there down the Ohio River. On September 30th, he reached Fort Fincastle, later named Fort Henry, a fort he had ordered built at Zanesburg. Meanwhile, the troop under Lewis, now counting 1,100 men, moved from Camp Union to the Kanawha River's source. They traveled down the river to the predetermined meeting spot, arriving on October 6th at what they called Camp Pleasant, known today as Point Pleasant. Not finding Dunmore there, Lewis sent messengers up the Ohio River to locate him. On October 9th, Dunmore responded, stating he was at the Hocking River mouth and planning to move to the Shawnee towns on the Scioto River. He instructed Lewis to cross the Ohio River and join him at the Shawnee settlements. On July 26, 1774, at the start of the war, a leader named Angus MacDonald led about 400 men across the Ohio River, aiming to attack Wakatomika's villages. His force was organized into 8 companies, and notable leaders like Michael Cresap, George Rogers Clark, and Daniel Morgan were in charge of some of these divisions. Just a few days after their arrival, on July 31st, MacDonald and his men had their first encounter with 3 Native Americans on horseback. Sensing it might be an ambush, MacDonald cleverly arranged his troops into 3 groups. They were indeed led into an ambush by 3 Native American scouts the very next day. However, MacDonald's forces were ready, managing to outmaneuver the ambushing party despite some casualties, reporting 2 of their men dead and 5 injured, with a single Native American confirmed killed. The Virginians then moved towards the Muskingum River, engaging in a skirmish with the village defenders there. They managed to kill 1 enemy without any losses on their side. During this skirmish, a fascinating moment of recognition happened between a Virginian, Joseph Nicholson, and a Lenape man, leading to a conversation with MacDonald. This Lenape man revealed that the villages had been warned by Pennsylvanians about the Virginians' approach and expressed a desire for peace between the Lenape and the white settlers. MacDonald proposed a deal, the release of 2 recently captured white women in exchange for sparing the nearby villages, also offering to hold 3 warriors hostage as a sign of good faith until a council could be arranged. However, when there was no response to his proposal, MacDonald ordered an attack on August 2nd, 1774. On their way, they discovered that the villages rejected their terms, according to a Mingo man they met and took hostage. Despite facing resistance and an ambush, MacDonald's forces eventually entered the villages, finding them abandoned. They decided to plunder and burn 1 Mingo and 5 Shawnee villages, but left the Lenape villages untouched due to their perceived neutrality. In these efforts, the Virginians lost 2 men and had several wounded, yet they managed to take 3 Shawnee captives and 3 scalps back to Wheeling. Despite their efforts, the attacks from Native Americans didn't stop, and MacDonald's campaign showed Governor Dunmore that a more formidable force was necessary. Before crossing the Ohio River on October 10th, Lewis and his troops were taken by surprise by warriors led by Chief Cornstalk. This unexpected encounter led to the Battle of Point Pleasant, which took place at the current location of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, right on the border with Ohio. The battle was intense, lasting almost the entire day and even escalating to close-range, hand-to-hand combat. The casualties suffered by Lewis's army were significant, around 215 in total, with 75 men losing their lives, including Lewis's own brother, and another 140 wounded. Despite these losses, Lewis's forces managed to defeat the warriors from the Ohio Confederacy, who then withdrew across the Ohio River, leaving behind approximately 40 of their warriors. A notable strategic move came from Captain George Matthews of the Virginia Militia, whose flanking maneuver played a crucial role in prompting Chief Cornstalk's forces to retreat. Following a successful engagement at the point, Dunmore and Lewis moved their forces into Ohio, coming close to the Shawnee settlements at what is now called Pickaway County, Ohio, near the Scioto River. There, they set up a temporary base they named Camp Charlotte on Sippo Creek. It was at this location where they started peace discussions with a Shawnee leader known as Cornstalk. According to the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, which was finalized on October 19, 1774, the Shawnee agreed to stop hunting south of the Ohio River and to stop bothering people traveling on the river. Although Chief Logan agreed to stop fighting, he decided not to be part of the formal peace negotiations. During this time, an individual representing Chief Logan, possibly Simon Girty, recited a speech given by Logan. This speech is remembered as one of the most notable in both Native American and Ohio history and is often referred to as Logan's Lament. When the Mingo tribe refused to agree to the peace terms, Major William Crawford led an attack on their village known as Seekonk, or Salt Lick Town, which is present-day Columbus, Ohio. Crawford, with a force of 240 men, completely destroyed the village. These actions, combined with the Shawnees' acceptance of the peace terms at Camp Charlotte, effectively brought an end to the war. The following year, the treaty was discussed again at Fort Pitt. This time, commissioners from the Continental Congress spoke with representatives from several tribes, including the Iroquois, Shawnee, Lenape, Wyandot, and Ottawa, urging them to stay neutral in the escalating tensions with Great Britain. In early November 1774, a group of Virginians in the army made their way back to their base camp at Fort Gower, located at the meeting point of the Ohio and Hocking rivers. This spot was named after a British lord, Earl Gower. Upon their return, they heard about a game-changing move by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, a boycott of English goods as a protest against the coercive acts. Realizing this was essentially an act of rebellion, these Virginians, feeling a growing sense of independence, penned what became known as the Fort Gower Resolves. This document was a clear sign of the burgeoning spirit of independence among the colonists, aimed at King George and their fellow Virginians. Among those present were notable figures who would later leave a mark on the Revolution, such as William Campbell, George Rogers Clark, and Daniel Morgan. At a gathering of officers under the command of the Honourable Earl of Dunmore at Fort Gower on November 5, 1774, the group considered the plight of British America. An officer addressed the assembly, highlighting their achievements and expressing a commitment to defend the rights and privileges of their country. Despite being isolated from the world, they maintained a readiness to use their abilities solely for America's and Virginia's benefit. The meeting decided to put their stance into formal resolutions, emphasizing loyalty to King George III as long as he honored the freedoms of a brave people. They declared a readiness to defend American liberty and support its just rights, but only through orderly means and when called upon by their countrymen. The Fort Gower Resolves were published in the Virginia Gazette on December 22, 1774, marking a pivotal moment. This was the first instance of colonists publicly stating their readiness to take up arms against the Crown to defend their rights, a stance tantamount to treason at the time. Effectively, these resolutions served as a declaration of independence in Ohio by Virginia's frontiersmen, a significant step months before the renowned shot at Concord and well before the Liberty Bell rang out to declare the colony's freedom. After issuing the resolves, Dunmore's militia retreated back across the Alleghenies, passing Redstone Old Fort and the great crossings of the Youghiogheny River, eventually making their way to Fort Cumberland and then to the capital at Williamsburg. The calm following a treaty did not last long before trouble stirred again. On March 24, 1775, a group of Shawnee, who seemed to ignore the Ohio River boundary, attacked Daniel Boone in Kentucky on the Wilderness Road. Despite this, by the time colonial forces won at Lexington and Concord, several permanent communities had taken root in Kentucky country. There was Harrodstown, Boone Station, Logan's Fort, and Lexington. In May 1776, just as the American Revolution kicked off, the Shawnee and a Cherokee chief named Dragging Canoe decided to declare war on the Virginia settlers once more, marking the start of the Cherokee-American Wars, which lasted from 1776 to 1794. Kentucky country would later become its own county in 1776 and then the state of Kentucky by 1792. The northern part, including Point Pleasant, would end up as the state of West Virginia. After Dunmore's War, Fort Gower was left behind. It is believed to be underwater now, just past Hockingport, Ohio. Fort Fincastle, which the colonial militia renamed Fort Henry, together with Fort Pitt and the later-built Fort Harmar in Ohio, 1785, played key roles in pushing the frontier beyond the Appalachian Mountains during the Cherokee-American and Northwest Indian Wars. A number of forts were built at the point during and after the Revolutionary War, but were eventually abandoned. Settlement along the Allegheny River was tough until the Indian Wars came to an end. Around that time, a settlement emerged at the point, officially becoming Point Pleasant in 1794. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.